A very good evening to our friends from Asia, good morning to our guests from North America, and a very good afternoon to our friends from Europe. Let me welcome you all to this Foreign Policy Conversations webinar on China's Communist Party turns 100. My name is Joe Thomas Karakat, and I am currently in charge of the IIT Madras China Studies Center. For an update, today we have participants from 19 countries, and that probably gives you a sense about how much this subject is of topical relevance. We are currently oversubscribed for this event. This July marks 100 years of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party and its first National Congress in Shanghai in 1921. 100 years since then, the party's rise has evoked a spectrum of responses from admiration to outright hostility. The party is admired for its embrace of the markets to reform the economy and lead China towards becoming the second largest economy in the world, and yet it has been criticized heavily for how it tackles political opposition. Some of the key talking points that we would have during the course of this webinar would include the Chinese Communist Party's evolution as a powerful political machine, the voice or voices that it represents. Also up for discussion would be the dynamics of morphing the party, the government, and the nation as one in the context of the PRC and how that works. And finally, we'll also be looking at China and its neighbors, specifically India's China policy and how that has fared. To discuss all of these issues, IIT Madras China Studies Center has partnered with some of the best minds in the domain of China studies, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our subject experts today. Professor Hans van der Ven is Professor of Modern Chinese History and the Director of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, St. Catherine's College, Cambridge University. He's a Fellow of the British Academy and is a subject expert on the history of modern China from 1850 onwards. His first book, titled From Friend to Comrade, The Founding of the Chinese Communist Party, was awarded the Philip Lilienthal Prize of the University of California Press for the best first book in Asian studies. Thank you, Professor Hans, and we welcome you. Next, we have Professor Michael Szonyi, Professor of Chinese History at Harvard University and Director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies there. A frequent commentator on Chinese affairs, Professor Szonyi is a Fellow of the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on US-China Relations. He recently completed a term as member of the China and Inner Asia Council of the Association for Asian Studies. Welcome, Professor Szonyi. We also have with us Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan, Chair Professor of Political Science and Head of the Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. Professor Cabestan has been Director of Research at the French National Center for Scientific Research, CNRS, and is also associated with the Asia Center in Paris. Welcome, Professor Cabestan. And we are very happy to have with us Professor Kishore Mahbubani, a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute at National University of Singapore. Professor Mahbubani was founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and has previously served as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and as president of the UN Security Council in January 2001 and May 2002. Welcome, Professor Mahbubani. With this brief introduction, I request Professor Szonyi to take over as chair for the session today. Audience members are reminded to switch off your mics and video at all times to ensure best broadband receptivity. You can, of course, send in your questions through the chat box throughout the session, but those would only be taken up during the Q&A session that we'll have at the end of the session. I would also like to remind our speakers that at the end of 12 minutes, you would see an IIT Madras transition slide, which would serve as a reminder for you to wind up. With this, the floor is all yours, Professor Szonyi.
Thank you so much, Professor Karakatu. You can hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Wonderful. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's my great pleasure to chair today's session, which coincidentally brings together 4 old friends and acquaintances, all of whom I would have seen in person over the last few months, were it not for this dreadful pandemic. The formal celebration of the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party on 1st July of this year was, as many participants here will know, a highly orchestrated performance of self-confidence, of a demonstration of the infallible judgment of the party, both past and present, and of the legitimacy of its rule, indeed the inevitability of its leadership of China for these last 70 years and going forward indefinitely into the future. Now, moments of official celebration, we all know, do not lend themselves to critical self-reflection. It's very much in the nature of a formal celebration not to do so. But I think this is actually especially true in China in 2021, when any reflection that challenges the official narrative now faces the potential of being condemned as historical nihilism. So paradoxically, it is actually outside of China and virtually that this kind of critical reflection can actually take place. For that reason, I am very pleased to join this event organized by Professor Karakatu and the IIT Madras China Studies Center. I think it's a timely and important event. And as I said, much as I would love to be able to engage in these conversations openly with colleagues in China, that is proving to be very difficult. Now, I think we should begin by recognizing that the Chinese Communist Party has much to be proud of. Its accomplishments are considerable. Not least among these accomplishments, of course, has been its ability to confound its critics' predictions of collapse. These predictions have been made since the very beginnings of the party, and they will continue to be made. To engage in the kind of critical reflection that I think our speakers will pursue in the course of the next hour or so and in the conversation to follow, I think it's useful to recognize that while this kind of critical reflection is sometimes seen as being unsympathetic to China, I think in many ways it's actually more sympathetic to the Chinese people than blind adulation and acceptance of official narratives. It's also very much what we as scholars do. It is, in a sense, part of the scholarly responsibility of those of us who study China and watch China from the outside. So with those initial framing remarks, let me turn immediately to our 3 distinguished speakers. Professor Karakatu has already introduced them, so I will not repeat those introductions, except to say again how happy I am to see all 3 of you, and I hope we will see each other in person soon. Hans, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you, Mike, and I can only echo your sentiment. It would be much more fun and probably interesting and productive if these meetings could take place in person. Especially, I think, because this is such a rare opportunity to be in conversation with scholars from India, as well as the United States and Hong Kong and so on. It's all too rare. So thank you, Joe, especially for organizing this opportunity. I think I just want to make a couple of very broad points about the Chinese Communist Party and its 100th anniversary. And then some of these we can explore further in the Q&A. I think the first point I would like to make is that the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party was an event, it's sort of what Mike already indicated, it was not supposed to happen really. It was not supposed to happen from a couple of different perspectives. If you are a believer in Marxism-Leninism, as the Chinese Communist Party still suggests it is, then according to Lenin, who's really the architect of communist parties, after the seizure of power, the state and the party must wither away and a new society must emerge. So even including from its own ideological, theoretical perspective, the party should not have lasted. And yet here we have a party that has not only achieved what a few other parties have done to live, communist parties have done to go on for 100 years, but have been in power for 72 years, which is no mean achievement. Also, I think, and this is really a point about which we need to think much more, it's not supposed to have happened if you believed in most Western theories of political, social, or economic development. And yet, as Mike said, authoritarian, dictatorial, one-party state policies are not supposed to produce the economic goods, and yet they have. They absolutely have. And so in that sense, the survival of the Chinese Communist Party is a real challenge to us to rethink theories about nation building, about social development, about economic development. And that's a very serious challenge. And I don't think we even have begun to think about this. So in my view, the situation that we face today is radically different than the West faced in terms of the Cold War. When very famously of George Kennan argued, he wrote from Moscow, the famous long telegram. He wrote that the Soviet Union and its system were simply, they would end up on the scrap heap of history. They would collapse under its internal contradictions, and therefore all that needed to happen was to wait and let the superiority of the Western liberal economic, social, political system win the war, which is what happened. This does not seem to have happened in the case of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a serious challenge. And George Kennan was right about the Soviet Union, but that kind of argument is difficult to sustain about China. Now, in beginning to answer that question, of course, one of the things that historians like me do is to see if there are clues in the history of the Chinese Communist Party itself to understand what this thing really is. I think one point I wanted to sort of bring across today is that the Chinese Communist Party has always had great difficulties with not being very transparent about what it really is. One of the things that stood out to me at the commemoration, the celebrations of the 100th anniversary, was that the military was kept away. When the Chinese Communist Party talks about successes, it talks about its economics. It's much less transparent, much less clear about the fact that one of the things that Xi Jinping has done has been beginning to transform the Chinese military. So there's this sort of occlusion of its military power. Now, the way in which the history of the Chinese Communist Party is usually told, both in China and in the West, is as a series of congresses with resolutions, of Politburo resolutions, which certain leaders then grab the real truth about a point in history and then push forward. And that's why you have Mao and Deng Xiaoping, and then, of course, now Deng Xiaoping and then Xi Jinping. And that's a very sort of text-oriented, Congress meeting-oriented kind of way of telling the party. Now, in the book that I have been very fortunate to publish with Cambridge University Press, working together with Tim Cheek, who works at UBC, University of British Columbia at Vancouver, as well as Klaus Mühlhahn in Germany, we have taken a very different approach. We didn't want to tell this story of this party line. We wanted to get into the whole question of what it means to live with, under, for, despite the Chinese Communist Party. To go down a level and then see what emerges from that kind of story. what it really means to be part of this great enterprise. And one of the great things about this book is that we actually have been able to work together with Chinese colleagues, with Xu Jilin, a great public intellectual in China, as well as Jiang Jishun. And their chapters are, to me, are really great eye-openers. And just to give an example of that, Xu Jilin is an intellectual and historian, and he wrote about another intellectual, Wang Yuanhua, who was trying to deal with the fact that the party was going into a way he really didn't like in the 1990s and 2000s. And was very critical from a liberal perspective. And so that comes out. And I think one of the lessons to draw from this is that the relationship of the individual member to the Chinese Communist Party is something like, and I know this, of course, from personal experience, that of a Catholic who has to struggle with the authority of Rome. Many of you might be Catholic, but I suspect it's the kind of relationship many of us actually have to deal with. You may disagree with a great deal, but nonetheless, you follow it, it's part of your life, etc., etc., etc. Now, from these 10 stories, so what we did was to have for each decade of the party's existence, we focused on one person going through a specific event in that particular decade. And I think what I learned from this exercise, and it was really me and Klaus and Tim learning, was there are other ways of thinking about the history of the Chinese Communist Party. And one in terms of periodization, but also one in terms of what it stands for. So besides a Mao, a Deng, or a Xi Jinping, we think that we can identify at least 3, possibly 4 traditions, and at least 3 in this way. You have a Communist Party that has a powerful, important, what you might call liberal humanist tradition. It is, of course, not in power today, but it was there in the 1930s, in the 1920s, and even for a while under Deng Xiaoping. And people like Xu Jilin and Jiang Jishun represent that tradition today. It's there, and so if we imagine the future of the Chinese Communist Party, it can not only draw from Western examples, which I think China is less and less inclined to do, but it can also look at its own history and see different traditions to work from there. So besides a sort of liberal humanist tradition, we think there is a cosmopolitan tradition, a very powerful, very important cosmopolitan tradition, which has, of course, been silenced today by, for much of the post-1949 period. But just one example, and I, of course, am, as a person who's grown up in Holland and identifies as a Dutch person, who else who could represent this cosmopolitan tradition than the real founder of the Chinese Communist Party, Henk Sneevliet, grew up in Holland, became a revolutionary in Indonesia, then worked with Lenin and M.N. Roy from India to develop a new revolutionary theory against imperialism, took that to China, and from there it went on and became the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Xi Jinping name-checked a couple of important people in his speech at the commemoration ceremony, but not Henk Sneevliet. It's unsurprising, but again, it's a tradition that stands there. And one of the interesting things today in China is that the early young historians in China today are again looking at the early founders of the Chinese Communist Party and finding interesting things to say about this. A lot of intellectuals who participated in the founding of the Chinese Communist Party then moved away from it. Some became opponents of the Chinese Communist Party, but they are being rethought by young historians. So my point is that when we think about the Chinese Communist Party, yes, there is that Xi Jinping tradition of highly authoritarian, highly disciplined rule, but there are other traditions. They are silenced, failed, but they're there. One of the other conclusions that we came through in pulling this book together is that one of the reasons that the CCP, well, there are two, how do you explain that the CCP has survived, despite the fact that it has had so much trouble, it has been the cause of so much misery. Before 49, but let's forget that for the moment, but after 1949, during the Great Leap Forward, if a party causes the death of between 30 to 50 or even 60 million people, its survival is a surprise. The Cultural Revolution is another example. So how do you explain that? And the conclusion we came to was that one of the things that really does stand out in the Chinese Communist Party's history is that it does reflect on its own past, it does think about it, and it can change tack very quickly. Mao himself turned against the party, and then Deng Xiaoping rescued it, actually. But not only can it change direction very quickly, it is also a highly disciplined party. A highly disciplined party that can enforce its discipline, as it is again doing today under Xi Jinping. And thereby, it therefore is able to sort of throw this ocean liner that is China into completely different trajectories as it jettisons some past history. So it's a combination of discipline, but also a highly critical attitude towards its own performance, its own past, and an ability to change course. All that means that the Chinese Communist Party we have today is not necessarily the one we will see 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, or even 100 years from now. Right, okay. Very briefly, in the 2 minutes that I have left, in terms of periodization, I think you can say you have a party that begins as a European form of Marxism-Leninism. It is then changed by Mao to become a rural revolutionary tradition, Marxism-Leninism, that jettisons most of Marx, actually. Then under Deng Xiaoping, you have a reform communism that takes up both traditional attitudes in China towards the market and to private enterprise, as well as from, of course, Western economic ideas. And I think under Xi Jinping, the best way that we can put it is that you have a counter-reformation, sort of a redisciplining of the discipline, a counter-reformation that jettisons much of the reform period and returns to what Xi Jinping thinks is what he can take from the Maoist legacy, especially of the 1940s, when he created this very disciplined organization that will triumph in 1949. So I think that's where we are. I think my 12 minutes are up. I hope that given enough cause for questions, for challenges, and for different perspectives. So thank you very much, and back to you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Hans, for that thoughtful and learned survey of the 72 years history of the party. One of the things that two things I think that strike me from your remarks: the importance of contingency in the history of the party. That there was discipline, there was self-reflection, but in a sense, there was also great luck. And this is sometimes challenging for historians to accept, because we think that big things should have big causes. And surely they do, but that's not the whole story. The other quick point I just want to make was I look forward to reading the book. I haven't read it yet, but one of the things I have been looking forward to especially is this notion that there are alternative narratives, that there are other ways of telling the story. The recuperation of tradition is, of course, one of the hallmarks of the Xi regime. It is extraordinary to see the leader of a modern communist party invoking Confucius regularly as a guide to future behavior. But one of the difficulties of invoking alternative narratives is that not all the narratives may actually serve the political purposes that you desire. I should stop here, and let me now turn to our second speaker.
Well,
Kishore, we'll go directly to you. Thank you.
I've been caught off guard. Never mind. I'll start. Let me make two sort of quick comments on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, because actually I've been asked to speak about China, India and its neighbors, so I'll do that too. And the two big comments I want to make about why the Chinese Communist Party is so resilient and so strong. The first point I want to make is that the real mission of the Chinese Communist Party is not to revive communism in the world. It is to revive Chinese civilization. And when you have that very large mission, and you feel a very deep sense of accomplishment in rejuvenating Chinese civilization, that's what has earned the trust and confidence of the Chinese people in the CCP. It's not that they love communism, but they are very happy that that China is back again. I think that's an important point to emphasize. And the second point I want to make here is that, Canon was mentioned. And in my book too, by the way, Michael, I wrote this, I did the research for this book when I was with you in Harvard, Has China Won? And on page 51, this is what I quote George Kennan as saying, by the way. He said, at the end of the day, the outcome of the contest between the United States and the Soviet Union would depend on the ability of America to, and I quote, create among the peoples of the world generally the impression of a country which knows what it wants, which is coping successfully with the problems of its internal life and with the responsibilities of a world power, and what has a spiritual capability, a spiritual vitality, capable of holding its own among the major ideological currents of the time, unquote. 4 limbs, okay? Knows what it wants, coping with its internal life, coping with the responsibilities of a world power, has a spiritual vitality. And here I'm going to say something obviously very provocative. On all these 4 limbs, between the United States and Soviet Union, United States was ahead on all 4 counts. But today, if you compare China and the United States, I can argue, as I did in an article that came out in the National Interest just a week or 2 ago, that actually China is now ahead on all 4 counts. And since this is a very controversial point to make, most people, when they look at a society, look at the top 50% of the society. Actually, what's more important, and this is something I learned, Michael, from a Harvard philosopher, John Rawls, whom I actually met when I was on a sabbatical in Harvard in '91. He said, what do you want to judge whether or not society is just or not? You don't look at the top 50%, look at the bottom 50%. And the bottom 50% in the United States haven't seen an improvement in their standard of living for 30 years. It's complete stagnation. And the United States is the only major developed country where life expectancy has actually gone down. Infant mortality went up. So all these indicators show that something is wrong in the United States. And by contrast, by the way, on all these indicators, China is doing very well. So that's the point to make about the Chinese Communist Party. Don't focus on the word communist. Focus on the condition of the Chinese people and what's happening there. And that's as a side on the Chinese. Let me turn now to India and its neighbors. And here I'm going to say, I suppose they expected it. I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. It's clear to the neighbors of India that India has decided to become a geopolitical competitor of China. Now, India hasn't announced this, hasn't declared it, but it's showing it in its behavior. And so the question I'm going to address is whether or not it's wise for India to decide to become a geopolitical competitor with China. And to answer whether it's wise or not, I'm going to address 3 questions. First, can India win this contest against China? 2, how do the neighbors do what India is doing? And 3, what will India's role be in this US-China contest that's emerging? But let me answer the first question. Can India win the contest? And this is a key point I want to emphasize. India, by the year 2050, it is possible for India to have the largest economy in the world. It can succeed. But as I say in an article that's about to publish, for India, it will take hard work and discipline, humility and sacrifice, strategic guile and cunning. India has all these qualities, but it hasn't deployed them vis-a-vis China. So the question, therefore, is why is so far China doing much better than India is? Right? I mean, in the year 1980, the Indian economy in nominal market terms was the same size as China. Today, China's economy is 5 times. And frankly, it might even become 6-7 times bigger than India. So what happened? What went wrong? And this India needs a deep self-reflection. And what's holding the Indian economy back is not external forces, internal forces in India. And India, basically, unlike China, which in a sense embraced globalization, India decided to walk away from it. And that's the difference. You know, I was in Davos in January 2017 when Xi Jinping said in a speech, China decided to plunge into the ocean of globalization. It struggled to swim. It drank water, but then it became stronger. So that's the big leap that China took. And that's the big leap that India is reluctant to take. And if you want any proof of this statement, I can tell you that most of India's neighbors, including, by the way, those who are very close friends of India, like Japan, like Australia, like Singapore, they actually delayed the completion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which was set up by the 10 ASEAN countries and includes China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. The friends of India kept delaying the agreement to try and persuade India to join. And I think in one of the most fatal decisions India has made in its history, it decided not to join the RCEP. I mean, the reason it gave, there's some legitimacy to it. There may be a surge of Chinese imports to India, further aggravate the trade deficit between China and India. You could have negotiated bilateral safeguards for that. But I think it also reflected a kind of a standard reflex in India, which is to avoid competition. And the crazy thing about this, which I emphasize, is that Indians are the most competitive economic animals in the world. Now, I can say this with some conviction because I'm Indian. Okay. And if you want proof of this, you go to the most competitive human laboratory in the world, which is the United States of America. And the best brains from Brazil and Argentina and Angola and Nigeria and China and Japan and South Korea and India come. Which ethnic group has the highest per capita income in the United States? It's the ethnic Indian group. So Indians can compete. And I think it's India's refusal to join this global competition that is handicapping India. And that's why I think India needs to engage in very deep reflection on what it needs to do to catch up with China. It can catch up with China, but it should stop blaming everybody else and look internally at what it's doing. And one leading indicator is look at its trade with the world. Look at China's trade with the world, how it has grown in the last 20 years. Look at India's trade with the world. I don't have the data off the top of my head, but anyway, you can all Google and get it. You see this dramatic disparity between the growth of China's trade with the world and India's trade with the world. So the possibility for India to succeed is real. So that's my first point. But a second point in terms of dealing with India's neighbors, I would say, to put it, again, we don't have much time, so I'm going to oversimplify things. There are 2 routes India can take. It can either take the route of the Quad, which is the Quad, as you know, set up by United States, Japan, Australia, and India, or it can work with ASEAN, the 10 countries of ASEAN. And what's the difference? I mean, again, to put it bluntly, even though the Quad will never declare that it is an anti-China organization, it is perceived to be an anti-China organization. Now, you can have a long debate about whether or not it is not, but if you want proof that it is perceived as an anti-China organization, notice that how few Asian countries want to join it. Most people are saying, you're taking a stand, that's your position. And what's interesting, the 10 ASEAN countries don't want to join. And here, the sad part of it all this is that if you look at the 10 countries in ASEAN, and if India was looking for the friendliest neighborhood it could find for India, it actually is ASEAN. Because out of the 10 countries in ASEAN, the cultural base of 9 of them comes from India. The cultural base of only 1, Vietnam, comes from China. And you know, this cultural roots of India in Southeast Asia go back 2,000 years or so, right? And what's interesting is that in the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia, right? When the then president of Indonesia wanted to celebrate something big happening, he built a huge statue of Arjuna. You go to Jakarta, you see a huge statue of Arjuna, right? In the middle of Jakarta. What does it tell? It tells you that India has got very deep connections. And when Philippines, the most Christian country in Southeast Asia, hosted an East Asian Summit leaders meeting, when it had put on a cultural performance, it put on Ramayana. So there is a tremendous reservoir of goodwill towards India in ASEAN. And that's also why India's rejection of the RCEP was a huge strategic mistake, because it basically slapped ASEAN in the face, because RCEP was an ASEAN initiative. And you know, India has been talking about looking east, acting east, but when it came to the most crucial step to take to actually integrate with the East, it failed to do so. And so I know I have 2 minutes left now. Let me quickly conclude by talking about the US-China contest. Because in many ways, the US-China contest obviously presents challenges for India, but I want to emphasize it also presents a tremendous opportunity for India. And what is this opportunity? Because you'll notice that most countries in the world, in one way or another, don't want to take sides in this contest between US and China. And that's a major part of the thesis. And what I'm amazed by the way, is that just 3 days ago, in the latest issue, The Economist comes to my desk, Biden's China strategy. And his thesis is that Biden's China strategy is flawed because most countries don't want to take sides. They want to have good ties with the United States. I want to emphasize that. But they also want to have good ties with China. And if you look at page 19 of this, The Economist, just look at one chart. The number in the year 2000, the vast majority of countries were trading with the United States. By the year 2020, the vast majority of countries trading with China. That shows how things have changed. Now, what is the opportunity for India in all this? What countries in the world are looking for is an alternative pole that they can go and turn to if they don't want to lean towards the United States or lean towards China. And India is big enough, strong enough to provide that alternative pole. But for India to do that, it's got to, in a sense, decide whether it is wise for it to choose that it will become a geopolitical competitor of China. And I believe that it's not that wise, and so India should reconsider where it is heading in this area. I hope I've not been too blunt and provocative in my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kishore. I'm sorry to catch you off guard, but as I predicted, you rose to the occasion. I'll just make one very quick comment, which is that leaving aside your last comments about advising India about how it should play a role in the bilateral competition, what really strikes me is that your advice for the United States and your advice for India is actually the same. The way to respond to the rise of China's power in the world is first to fix their own internal problems, and secondly, to embrace globalization and multilateralism and not isolationism and withdrawal. I suspect it's wise advice for both countries. I hope the leaders will listen. Time is short. Let me move immediately to Jean-Pierre, who I hope we can hear now.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So now I'm going to move back to China, and in the 10 or 12 minutes which have been given to me to focus on the dynamic of the party and the government, and the fact that China is a one-party system was for a long time perceived as an obstacle to development. And today it's presented as a major factor, including of course, by the Communist Party itself, of economic rise and empowerment, and putting China in a better position than India, for instance, in its competition with the United States for world supremacy. Now, let me go back to the foundations of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in 1949. What happened in 1949 is a bit like what happened in the Soviet Union in 1917, which was you have a revolutionary party, the Chinese Communist Party, taking control of the state and creating a new state, which is the PRC. It means that the party leads everything, and I think there is a lot of continuity in that assumption. It leads not only the state but also the military. As we say in Chinese, Dang Zhang Jun are the three pillars of the regime, but the party leads the other two pillars, the government and the military. So it means that the party appoint the cadres, in particular the leading cadres within the party, but also within the military and of course within the state. And this hasn't changed much, although in the mid-50s what happened was to sort of try to copy the Soviet model and the Khrushchev model more in depth with central organization of the party supervising each ministry, and that's what the role of Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi at the top of the party, supervising all the ministries of the State Council, which was formerly chaired by Zhou Enlai, the prime minister. Now, the Cultural Revolution sort of shook all that for 10 years, and actually with the criticism of many party leaders, the dismantlement of party committees at the central and the local levels, the State Council has remained one of the key pillars of the government all the way to the early reform era in the late 70s, early 80s. And but that doesn't mean that the State Council was detached from the party. It was actually operating under the supervision of the party Politburo at the center, and at the local level. If you remember, the Revolutionary Committee set up in 1967 and onward were actually merged with the party committee, which were gradually restored in the following years as well. With the reform era, there was an attempt to change that. And I would like to say a few words about the 1980s, which were very interesting years because Deng Xiaoping introduced a number of reforms in order to make the party more efficient, but also to better check and rein in the arbitrariness of many party leaders and cadres at the local level. So it tried to introduce, if not a separation of power, at least some limitation of power at the center and the local level in reorganizing the party state organization. There was an attempt to restore the secretariat, but that failed, and the 1956 model was never really restored. So you had a kind of division of labor between, on the one hand, the party machinery, headed by, at the time, by Hu Yaobang, and the government headed by Zhao Ziyang, who was in charge of the State Council. At the end of the 1980s, in 87, 89, there was a very interesting attempt to separate the party and the government, to give more leeway to the government, and to reduce the party leadership to political leadership as such, delegating to the government organs more responsibilities in terms of administrating the local branch of the government, but also in running the economy, and that went hand in hand with the decentralization of the economy and the revival of private businesses and private enterprises, first in the counties and the townships, and later in the urban areas. That came to a head in 1989, and the party decided to forget about the 党长分开, or separation between the party and the government. And since then, actually, the model, which was restored in '89 after the Tiananmen crackdown, has been in place without any change. What has happened with Xi Jinping since 2012 has been a double decentralization of power, both within the Communist Party to the detriment of the state machinery, the state council and the ministries, but also in the hand of the center and Xi Jinping himself to the detriment of localities. And that raises quite a number of questions regarding how much this is a factor of economic development, or whether it can be a hurdle to future economic prosperity in China. Now, today it's well known that the party leads everything, not only the state, the military, the civilians, the education sector, but as Xi Jinping said once, east, west, south, north, and the center, the party leads everything. So I think here there's been a number of changes which were introduced in particularly in 2017, 2018 by the party center, which was to create new commissions and to turn the leading small groups of the Central Committee into full-fledged commission reporting to Xi Jinping, or for many of them, chaired by Xi Jinping himself. So the question, of course, is whether it's this more static approach to managing the economy, the party's ambition to impose more control on the private sector, the private businesses, and the recent example of Alibaba disputes with the central authorities is a case, I think, which can be discussed maybe later, but which shows that the party wants to put limits to the autonomy of private businesses. And within the society itself, we can see also a growing control of the NGOs and the society as a whole with these new social credit system, which has been put into place in the last few years. The question, of course, is whether it's a factor of development, whether it can help China to make some technological advancements and to foster our research and development, and to compete, in a stronger position with the United States. For the time being, I have to say that Xi Jinping has not been proven wrong, but we see a number of factors in the economy and including in the high technology sectors, where actually these stronger rigidity of the system can become an obstacle for future development. The problem is for Xi Jinping and his successors is how to change the system. And if you put aside the attempt which was introduced in the 80s to reduce the influence of the party in the economy, in the society, there is a lot of continuity actually in the way the party sees the society and runs the society and the country as a whole. And here it brings us to a question fundamental question, whether the party can reform itself, can really open up the system, which is based on secrecy, opacity of the party, and cooptation and very top-down system, and whether this system can be reformed without jeopardizing actually the very foundation of the whole party system. And here I have some doubts actually about the ability of the party to reform itself. In spite of the tradition which were mentioned by Johan earlier, liberal traditions or more cosmopolitan traditions, the fact that those traditions never prevailed in China, I think, show that the only way for the Communist Party to rule China is this very top-down, opaque system, which gives the party the monopoly of power, and in particular political power. The risk of today's is that with Xi Jinping these the party goes too far in trying to control the whole economy, and can become an obstacle to economic development. But the answer won't be found before, today, but only in the future. So I will leave with that question, and hope we can come back to these some of these points in the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, for very thoughtful and carefully researched comments. I'm struck that we've actually had two speakers comment on issues of periodization, and to try to blend your comments and Hans's comments, it sounds like you would argue that the Counter-Reformation can actually be traced back to 1990, or basically to June 5th. 1989, a very interesting idea. One comment I'll simply add to that is that there have been a whole sequence of developments that were thought at the time by Western observers to undermine the Counter-Reformation. The middle class, the rise of the middle class was supposed to signal the end of centralization. That didn't work. The need to open up financial markets was supposed to signal the end of centralization. That didn't come to pass. And now we see the same thing with technology. And so it speaks, coming back to something that Hans said, of the extraordinary capacity of the party for self-reflection and course correction. We have time for only a couple of questions. We have about 6 minutes left. I think I'm going to actually begin with the question that I think all of our speakers might be able to speak to, which comes to us from LV Krishnan. The party has demonstrated great capacity for successful course corrections on critical issues related to internal issues. Now the external situation in the world poses very different problems. Will the party be able to manage these kinds of challenges as well as they have internal challenges in the past? And I'll simply throw that open to all three of our speakers to address. But I guess I should be a more effective chairman. So in the spirit of Chairman Mao, Hans, why don't you go first?
Oh, thank you very much. I didn't want to go first. My name is, my surname begins with a V, so I'm always last. I'm perfectly content with that position. Will China, or specifically CCP, be able to deal with the external challenges? I think one point I want to make is that, and Mike, you kind of referred to that, I think in Europe and the United States, there's a tendency to swing between a Romanization of China versus a demonization of China. That goes back to the 17th and 18th century, and it's been a constant in our perceptions and the way that we deal with China. So I think there's a warning there to foreign observers, foreign policy makers, to be critical about their own, it was the financial crisis. China can't possibly work financially. And then these are our worries projected onto China, but actually our worries and we can, I think, I'm a historian, I think about the past, I don't think much about I do think about the future, and context is everything. Will China be able to deal with it? The world is very complex. I don't think we're going to go back to some kind of Cold War between two centers of power. The kind of thing that I think Kishore was really referring to is a much more complex world with all kinds of centers of powers and levels of competition, some very transparent and global, some much more local. So very, very difficult. The only way that China is going to be able to deal with that, if it is sufficiently informed. Now, one of the things that is true about China and Beijing today is that it is tremendously well informed about Europe, the United States, probably less so the Middle East, and probably even less so India. But they are far more informed about us than we are about them. So I think that's where we have a negative, and they're actually in a better position for this much more complex world than we are. But it does mean building all these kinds of relationships, being able to be informed, keeping a sense of what their real interests are. And I guess the other point to make is that China is emerging as a superpower. No superpower has emerged that has done so in a way that we all stand around and applaud it. It's not been true for Holland. It's not been true for France. It's not been true for England. It's not been true for the United States. And I don't expect it's going to be true for China either. That's the reality of emerging as a superpower. So that creates all kinds of difficulties and is perhaps one way of avoiding the answer while raising some factors that go in. I mean, I'm always hoping for the best, and I want a positive outcome to this. In my heart of hearts, I think we're going to have a lot of trouble. Yeah.
Kishore, please. Please.
Yeah, I think very quickly. My view, China will be able to handle its external problems as pragmatically as it has handled its internal problems. You know, every time people think China's going to collapse, it doesn't collapse. So it's very pragmatic. And in the same way externally, and I guess I use as an exhibit A, ASEAN, because I think about 20 years ago, the Chinese saw that at some point in time, the United States would try to launch some kind of policy to counter China, contain China, and one place to go to is Southeast Asia. And that's why, as you know, in the year 2000, to complete surprise of ASEAN, instead of their Western partners proposing a free trade agreement with ASEAN, it was China that proposed a free trade agreement. And the consequence of that, and this is an important piece of data, in the year 2000, United States trade with ASEAN was $130 billion, and China's trade with ASEAN was $40 billion, 1/3 of United States. But after 20 years, United States trade went up from 130 billion to 300 billion, 3 times. But ASEAN's trade with China went up to 660 billion from 40 billion. Now, that's clearly thinking long-term and saying, okay, we want to make sure all our neighbors are integrated with us. And then when you add the Belt and Road Initiative, you add the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, you add the New Development Bank, you can see that China has worked systematically, methodically to create patterns of interdependence within the Chinese economy and lots of other economies. And that's the best deterrence for anyone trying to mount a containment policy against China. Now, they made mistakes. I think they made lots of mistakes in Europe, for example. Europe was, in a sense, not sure which way it's going to go, but there has been an alienation in Europe, and that's a challenge for China. They made mistakes with India, for sure. So they're not perfect. But on balance, I would say overall, they have a very careful, systematic way of managing the external relationships.
So Hans has said there will be problems, but Kishore has said they will succeed. Jean-Pierre, the deciding vote to you.
Okay, can I introduce a word of doubt here? First of all, I think Xi Jinping is more a risk taker than his predecessor. That has created some opposition within the party against his foreign policy, as taking too many risks, and opposing or confronting the US heads-on, maybe not the best policy for China. Now, is Xi Jinping going to launch a war against Taiwan? Maybe, but I think it's unlikely, because that will be a big mistake. And that's one of the limits of the more risk-taking policy developed by Xi Jinping. Actually, Xi Jinping in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait, or in the East China Sea, is very active in the gray zones, and he's been very good at playing with the gray zones. But at the same time, all those risks are very calculated risks. And the big challenge for China will be to manage crisis in the future, in particular crisis with the United States. Military crisis I'm referring to. So, and there is some ability to, I mean, we know, I mean, if you look at the EP3 incident to 2001 and other incidents in South China Sea, I think both sides can manage crisis. And with India, I mean, last summer, China has been able to manage the crisis. I wouldn't say it was perfect, but it didn't lead to a war. So I think that's what I would say about China's relation with the outside world. As it grows more powerful, as its military grows more powerful, there will be a growing temptation to use its military outside of its borders. Now, I would end up, but the question is how, and I think again, the Chinese leadership will be tempted to use its military where the risks are limited or can be kept under control. Now, we'll end up with the relationship between the external relations and foreign policy and domestic politics. One of the big reasons for China's image to have deteriorated in Europe and in America and other parts of the world is a question of human rights. And the way China is, the Chinese government is acting in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong more recently, and the human rights situation in China itself is becoming a big issue for the public opinions of a number of countries, impacting other countries' behavior with China. Of course, it doesn't mean that the Europeans are going to stop doing business with China, but it's getting harder for Angela Merkel and Macron and other leaders to deal with China as it were a normal country. And I think for the Chinese leadership, it's going to be a big challenge in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. These were enormous issues that you were asked to explore, and it's hardly surprising that we were not able to resolve them in an hour. But it's been very stimulating to hear from all three of you and to hear the questions from the audience. I wish there was time to take more questions. It's been these are challenging issues. They're of course also very important issues. They impact our lives and the lives of future generations, and therefore it's been my privilege to participate. Let me now turn things back to our hosts in Madras, Professor Karakatu, to say one or two concluding remarks. Thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you very much, Professor Szonyi, and let me join the audience members in thanking our speakers, Professor Hans van der Ven, Professor Michael Szonyi, Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan, and Professor Kishore Mahbubani, on what has been a fantastic reappraisal of what the Communist Party's last 100 years have meant for China and also for the world. I'd also like to thank my team members, Ramnath, Ashna, Adira, Neha, and Amartya for their support and outreach that has made this event possible. And lastly, I'd like to thank our audience members from 19 countries. I must add that we had at any time over 100 participants during the entire webinar. So that has been very encouraging. Thank you for your patience and support. And I hope you would visit our website, csc.iitm.ac.in, and our Facebook and Twitter handles for more information on our future events. So with that, let me thank you all once again. Take care of your health and have a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.